My major concern is not about 2024. My major concern is that we are in this crisis management mode, not truly strategic mode. If you look at this situation from the standpoint of Vladimir Putin, it gives him another hope that, well, I can wait patiently for a year, for 2 years, and sooner or later there would be a lack of this readiness to support Ukraine.
This is a conversation with Mykola Bilieskov, a Ukrainian analyst and a research fellow at the National Institute for Strategic Studies of Ukraine, under the Ukraine's presidential administration. We talked about why the Western model of support for Ukraine is not working anymore, why Ukrainians are hesitant to join the military, why is he more worried about the next year than this one, or why NATO might have to join the conflict one way or another in the end. It's a very honest conversation that definitely changed how I think about a number of different things. And even though it's not very optimistic, it's definitely extremely interesting. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. You allow me to keep doing this. And if you don't, consider becoming a supporter. You will get full ad-free episodes, bonus content, and the ability to ask my guests your questions. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for an invitation.
I think if we can start by maybe talking about sort of the high-level overview of what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, because it seems that there's a lot of various different opinions and views on what's going on right now and how good or bad the situation is. At least it seems like that to me, because even in Ukraine, you had in the past month the deputy head of the military intelligence who said that he expects the situation to get much worse, while the commander of Ukraine's ground forces said that he expects Ukraine to repel all the Russian attacks without any significant losses. And I wonder if, when you look at it, what is sort of your high-level assessment of the situation at this moment, and how optimistic or pessimistic are you at this point?
Well, maybe starting from the last thing you mentioned, how I'm pessimistic or optimistic. My major concern is not related to the current events. My major concern is middle to long term. So the major problem that we have aid guaranteed for the end of 2024, maybe beginning of 2025. But then we'll have another round of discussions, negotiations to reach an agreement that Ukraine should be supported, especially in case of US. And that's a major problem, as for me, major concern, because you can't win war. You can't do a credible strategy, implement credible military strategy when you need each year to fight a very difficult fight to guarantee aid. That's the most difficult thing. And another dimension of this problem is that if you look at this situation from the standpoint of Vladimir Putin, it gives him another hope that, well, I can wait patiently for a year, for 2 years, and sooner or later there would be a lack of this readiness to support Ukraine. So that's the most problematic thing as for me, that we're still in a period of the crisis management. We are not in a period of long-term strategy properly thought out with what is attainable, what is unattainable, properly financed and then implemented. So we're still in this mode of addressing current problems without any long-term approach. And the problem is that if we don't have this long-term approach, properly balancing all ways, means, and instruments how to connect to things with goals, of course, then we would have a problem of sustaining proper level of interest, especially in US, because US is a very interesting country. They they can both quickly acquire interest and then quickly lose interest, and that's the problem. And especially if you look at a number of conflicts where US was involved, US is to a certain extent, at least, US is only good either in quick wars of annihilation or World War I, World War II, major conflagrations with a huge moral dimension, maximalist goals, and so on. Everything else is very difficult for the US, especially wars where they are not directly involved, where they're just a major supporter. of the player on the ground. So that's my major concern. That's the point of major interest point of our actions, so as to what we should strive, and that's it. In terms of current battlefield, what I can say, yes, we're in a period of when Russia has initiative. It's not a strategic initiative where Russia has a total preponderance of forces, of equipment, and can force its will upon Ukraine and make it fight on extremely unfavorable terms. But yes, it's a point of war where Russia has initiative, where unfortunately Russia was given time to mobilize, where Ukraine was not able to decimate Russians as far as we can. I mean, we did our best since November 2023 when Russia turned to offensive action along all major axes, but still we didn't manage to inflict the amount of casualties that would guarantee that Russian grouping of forces would not increase. Unfortunately, we've seen the opposite situation when, since September 2023 till May 2024, Russians managed to increase grouping of forces by approximately 90,000. If you look at the official statements, despite losing, under conservative assessment, 17-20,000 months, both dead and wounded. So yes, we're in a period when Russians have an advantage. It's not absolute advantage. They try to press it as far as possible, with US aid flowing, with aid out of different European countries flowing, with law on mobilization adopted. I think we can address current situation. There might be a situation when we need to withdraw, unfortunately, because again, you can't quickly remedy and quickly close this window of opportunity that Russia now has, that appeared because of the 7 months of the acute deficit of weaponry and not very favorable attrition rate. But my major concern is not about 2024. My major concern is that we are in this crisis management mode, not truly strategic mode. And referring to assessments provided by General Skibitsky, who is a representative of main intelligence directorate, military intelligence. Yes, you can say that. Well, they provide conflicting opinions because his immediate chef, General Budanov, while speaking to Ukrainian BBC here in Ukraine, he said that, well, it would be difficult, but we would address this difficulty. So yes, you can say there is a conflict, but you should keep in mind that General Skibitsky was addressing foreign audience, and usually when Ukrainian authorities are addressing foreign audience, they try to highlight different kind of risks. So in this case, this is natural. This is expected thing that while dealing with foreign audience, foreign stakeholders, Ukrainian representative, each one, you can pick everyone. He would usually highlight worst case scenario, vulnerabilities, maybe that should be addressed, while simultaneously in domestic communication we see that there is cautious, well, not optimism, but still cautious realism and no gloom and doom, and that's actually natural, because if you try to do it the opposite way, that only gloom and doom inside and bare optimism outside, it's also not sustainable. So in this case, I just would like to suggest to everyone that you should keep in mind different audiences, different Ukrainian officials try to address in their communications.
I think it's really interesting that you've sort of jumped to the strategic picture of the medium and long term vision. And I think it's also interesting that you're less concerned about 2024 and more concerned about the years to come, because I would say a number of analysts that I've spoken to have it the other way, where they would say that 2024 is going to be the most difficult year and it should get easier as the time goes on, because Russia would start to um, face a lot of similar difficulties that Ukraine is facing at the moment, when Ukraine cannot rely on a long term supply of equipment, but at the same time, Russia is burning through its stocks of Soviet era equipment really quickly, and by 2025, it should start having issues with both manpower and equipment and the economy, and at the same time, European production of ammunition and arms should be increasing in 2025 and 2026. So that would be the counter argument that I sometimes hear, and I wonder what is your view on that?
Well, in terms of possible Russian problems, I agree. The only thing is to get there. So this idea that Russian stock is limited, soon they are going to face problems. Look, we hear it since 2022, and banking that their stock should be depleted and they won't be engaged any foreign assistance. As for me, bare optimism is not a reliable source for strategy, because still China is a wild card, and maybe they don't want Russia to win outright for obvious reasons. They want to see Russian weaken and as a subservient to China, but they also don't want to see Russia lose. And it means that we should keep in mind this opportunity, that when Russians would face problems, then China manufacturer would address them. So this bare optimism, it's not like a good source, good basis for the strategy. That's the first thing. Another thing, yes, you mentioned that European US industrial complex would produce more compared with the current period, but that's only part of the story. Another part of the story, whether there would be political readiness to support it with funds, because every time, as we see, it's more difficult. And it's why it's more difficult to engage aid, especially in US, because there is people who say, look, we don't want to invest just in status quo. We don't want to invest in the front line not moving. We want to see outright victory. So that's why, again, we see the downsides of this crisis management approach. And that's the reason why it was so difficult before, like to engage US during this last 7 months. So yes, Russia would face problem, especially in armor, because now they rely mostly on Soviet stock. So the amount of T-90M proportionate to the other main battle tanks is small one. So Russian mostly use refurbished T-72, T-62, T-54, T-55 main battle tanks. The same is true with artillery. They now employ mostly towed artillery instead of self-propelled artillery, and usually it's older generation howitzers, not the howitzers of 70s and 80s. It might be even howitzers of 1960s and so on. But more this war is allowed to go on, more and more difficult it is to sustain politically, because whether or not Ukraine would be able to tap into increasing stock of Western munition depend on political decision, political dimension. And unfortunately, more this war goes on, more realistic scenario for Ukraine, or what we can attain realistically, is just to keep frontline. More it's to engage Western aid, especially US aid. And that's the problem, that's the trick. So Ukraine need to go through 2024, 2025, and only then, maybe in 2026, Russia would face problems. And that's, as for me, on the one hand, yes, you're right in terms of they might face a problem, but we still need to go to these 2 years. And also keep in mind that fighting is ongoing not only along the front line. Russia is targeting the whole country, try to destroy critical infrastructure. We see how it's difficult to sustain interest to engage more and more air defense. So we plead for 7 batteries of Patriots. We only have 3 or 4. And its critical function of the state is the function of the amount of air defense batteries we have. And that's the problems of this approach. That people say, we need just to go through 2 additional years. That's absolutely right. But we need to have political will implemented in the funding decisions. And we also should have not only a proper amount of artillery shells, GMLRS ammo, but also air defense, both surface-to-air missiles and fighter planes. So there is a lot of, I would say, unaddressed elements of this approach, which in itself I don't see contradiction with what I said. Though we should keep in mind always risks. Risks are increasing. More this war is allowed to go on, it would be more easier for skeptics to argue why we should support Ukraine, and people naturally start to lose interest, and they want to have like a maximalist result, like recovering all the territories. Otherwise, everything else is not like a triumph for them worth of investment. So there is a lot of elements this approach you mentioned can't address, and a lot of risks, because 2 years in current world with very short attention span, very short interest span is way too high bar to cross.
That is definitely true, but I wonder if the shift in approach that you're talking about, if that is realistic, that we will see that happen during the course of this war, especially from the side of the United States, which is the most important. And I guess if you think that it's important for Ukraine to try to push for this to happen, that there will be sort of a long-term strategy and predictability in how much support it can get and how much support it can rely on, or whether it might have to somehow work with the unpredictability and the fact that it will just simply not be able to know how much support it can get over the coming years, which is probably the most probable outcome. So I guess from your view, what is the best strategy for Ukraine to go forward in regards to this?
In this case, we are too dependent, so there are variables we don't control. So ultimately, everything would depend on the level of financial commitment. If Western countries, if Europe, North America adopt decision to increase spending on defense from the current level to the level of Cold War, which is 4 or 5% of GDP, then we can credibly build a strategy and implement a strategy that at least aim to arrest Russian advances and to drive Russia to the conclusion that you can't advance. You should at least agree with the current front line, because currently Russians they work from the assumption that they can push front line, however slowly, while simultaneously undermining Ukrainian will to fight. Among other things, exploiting this very crisis management mode. So it's up to Western Europe, Europe in general, North America to adopt this or that decision. In this case, Ukraine can plan realistic strategy, but we are too dependent, and it's up to our partners in Europe and in North America to adopt this decision. Otherwise, we have this situation that in most ironic one, close to absurd. So NATO is bragging, we are 20 times more GDP than Russia. We have more technology, so on. Russia has more artillery shells.
Do you see this shift happening at least in Europe, if not in the United States? And I wonder perhaps the different bilateral agreements that Ukraine has signed with the UK, France, Spain might be sort of a guarantee of a long-term commitment for aid and funding of Ukraine for the coming years.
Well, we see optimistic signals among them Czech Shell initiative, which is a welcome sign, though, to be honest with you, Ukrainians expected deliveries sooner, because there is a gap. I don't know for what kind of reasons, logistics one, between the statements that we assembled necessary amount for at least the first batch and the possible shipment. That's the first thing. Second thing, we never tested the situation when there is no US aid, when Europe is on its own. And again, I don't know, unfortunately, I still don't know to what extent Europe would be able to stick to this approach. So there might be a situation when countries would say, look, we're not going to do it. We don't have US backing us. So we still haven't seen the situation which really tested the will to extreme extent under real conditions. Currently, we still have US as its dispensable partner. Let's be honest, if there would be no aid out of US For Ukraine, it would be really difficult to keep the current front line, to implement current strategy. We would be under the risk of being pushed out at the tempo we've seen around Avdiivka, for instance, in last couple of months. So that's my fears. Though we see, yes, a lot of agreements, a lot of initiatives, pledges. So we usually show your money, basically. Agreements are important thing, but when they are supported by hard currency, that's the most valuable evidence that people mean business. And as for me, these agreements, they are step forward, they are important, but I see a number like weak points, hypothetical weak points. First thing, they are not ratified by the parliaments. It doesn't give them enough credibility. So that's one thing. Another thing, we don't know to what extent this opinion, this consensuses shifted with regards to Ukraine. What I mean that before 21st of February 2022, Ukrainian security was declared as essential for European security, but not supported with money. We've seen this shift. We've seen that there is a lot of declarations, a lot of actions, a lot of investment pledges, and so on. But with no ratification by the parliament, we can't be sure as to what extent this consensus sink in the psyche of the population, of the establishment, of the think tank, of the media, and everything else. And let's imagine situations that not current government, not the next government in any country that is either concluded agreement or is going to conclude agreement, but the third government in a row would come and say, well, in our interpretation of this agreement, our commitment is not as broad as Ukraine would like it to see. So yes, it's a progress. It's a more detailed agreement than Budapest Memorandum. We are a country traumatized by Budapest Memorandum. We surrendered a huge chunk of Soviet nuclear arsenal for nothing, unfortunately. We've seen another level of cooperation, another level of commitment out to Europe, different European countries. We've seen these agreements that are more detailed, but still they have weak points that to fullest possible extent doesn't guarantee its functionality, I don't know, in a period of 5+ years. And that's a major problem. That's why Ukraine is knocking NATO door. Because only agreement that is ratified, only clear-cut security guarantee in the eyes of Ukraine after the experience of the Budapest Memorandum is really what we want to have and to be certain in our long-term security. So it's a progress, but as for me, it's not enough. And these agreements might have worked brilliantly during 2015-2021 period, when we've seen Russian aggression, but more limited one, and Putin was calculating his chances. And if he's seen the level of commitment, what we've seen after 21st of February 2022, maybe he might have been deterred. Currently, as I demonstrated, it's not enough. And again, I don't know. That's my only guess. My thinking. We might be approaching the limit of the model adopted in 2022. So, Ukraine, this is your weaponry. Combine it with your own people and fight. That's why Ukrainians are welcoming this initiative by President Macron, who said that we should be more unpredictable. We should, in different ways, engage with Ukraine more directly, including on Ukrainian territory and so on. So we shouldn't underestimate scenario when sooner or later NATO in general or different NATO countries on a bilateral basis would need to bring troops as those who would man air defense system, as those who would train Ukrainian troops and so on to be a kind of deterrent against Russia further advances, and to be credible in Putin's eyes. Because again, as I understand, these agreements, either concluded or negotiated, they are seen, especially by the Biden administration, as a mean to force Putin to the acceptance of long-term commitment of the Western countries and to force him to negotiations. So he'll understand that Ukraine has this long-term backing and so on. But we are going to see. as to what extent this hypothesis works. As for me, I won't bank on this idea that these agreements, along with the current aid, would be enough to drive Putin to the conclusions that yes, it's futile to fight with Ukraine. We need to agree with Ukrainian existence because there is this kind of commitment. So we're going to see whether this kind of commitment is enough both to guarantee long-term Ukrainian security and to be credible in Putin's eyes, which is the most important audiences of these agreements, actually.
And when you say that the current model of support for Ukraine, when Western countries say, here's the weapons, use them with your people, when you say that that's sort of not working anymore, or we're reaching the limit of its usefulness, can you elaborate on why is that not working anymore compared to maybe a year ago or when the war started? And what exactly do you think it should be replaced with? And if I understand it correctly, if you think it should be basically NATO troops in Ukraine, and then I guess the question is, in what role should they be there in order for them to have a real impact?
Well, I say it's only my guess that we might approach the limits of this situation. The major problem is that escalation management cost us first professional army, second Ukrainian readiness to join ranks. So when people are saying, look, Ukrainians are not as ready to join ranks as it was in 2022, but they are not ready to accept explanation. So people seeing what is modern battlefield. It's very lethal. It's very dangerous. And again, we've seen this 7 months gap. And you can't replay the situation. So when people are saying, there is your aid, just engage more troops. It's so easy. No, it doesn't work this way. Because first, people seeing the results of this gap. Second, they are not sure whether aid would be next year with the current conditions. So readiness of joining ranks decrease because, unfortunately, for all these 2+ years, Ukraine compensate lack of firepower with its people, with troops, with their lives, with their health. And people in Rea, they have relatives in frontline, friends in frontline, and there is a lot of instances documented when people who fight, they say to their relatives, to their friends, so it's a really dangerous place. And that's one of the part of the equation that makes difficult to engage more troops. That's the one thing, and make mobilization more difficult. Another thing, Ukrainian, like the stock of people, I'm sorry for this term, but Ukrainian reserves are not limitless. So there are only 30 million people inside Ukraine. We minus this 8 millions who moved out. And of them, the share of people who can fight without undermining economy is not indefinite. So we are not in a situation of the first half of the 20th century. Because when people are saying you just need to mobilize more, it's a solution, but only temporary solution to Ukrainian problems. And again, the amount of these people, the reserves, are not limitless, and demographics is different one. And if people want to see Ukrainian nation preserved, so they either should supply us with proper amount of firepower or being ready ultimately to step in different functions. First, as a support role, so manning surface-to-air missiles, maybe also aiding with airplanes, with training functions. But this model of here is your weaponry, combine it with your own men, it might have worked smoothly in 2022, 2023. More this war is allowed to go on, more this dilemma has more chances to appear as real one, that sooner or later we should see engagement out of our partners. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to balance first fight in war, uh, also meeting all the requirements of the war economy, and also ensuring civilian economy, because there is already a deficit of people in service sector, and it's going to increase. And like in World War I, there was a situation when, like Germany, it need to decide whether it direct its men to the front or has men working in the economy in the rear, and that's it. So we should keep in mind these dilemmas of history, and also look at the demographics of Ukraine, and to first emphasize firepower, and hopefully it would work. Or otherwise, there might be a situation. Again, it's only a hypothetical scenario, but it should be kept in mind, and it explains why Macron initiative is so welcomed in Ukraine, so applauded in Ukraine, because it's about situations that might eventually appear that sooner or later there should be meaningful presence in this or that capacity to help Ukraine.
I think it's really interesting that you say that Macron's initiative is so welcome in Ukraine, because I tend to be a little bit skeptical about it, um, because somehow see it as maybe distracting attention from the real issue, which is the need for more equipment and more support and more aid and more firepower. Because if there are French troops in Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers or uh, helping with logistics in the rear, the question is whether that would really have a decisive impact, because for it to have an impact you would probably need really large amounts of people present in the country, um, or have them actually maybe take part in combat deployment, because you probably, as we've heard from a lot of sources, there already are uh, instructors and soldiers from various different NATO countries already in Ukraine who are taking part in training soldiers there. So I guess maybe what is your view on that? Whether that really is something that could change the situation significantly, or whether that might be just distracting the situation, distracting us from the real impactful policies and ways in which we could help Ukraine.
Well, I don't like the scenario when there is like a criticism of this initiative while saying we should compensate with more equipment, firepower, and so on, but there is still deficit of firepower. So, from the point of view, again, if we look at the details of what Macron said, he said that there might be a situation if Russians advance. We don't know at what line they would advance, that we should deploy our own troops. So, as for me, he was describing the situations that might happen if Ukraine is not provided with firepower. Because now we have a situation that Macron is criticized, give us more firepower, give us more pledges and so on, but we still have this deficit of firepower. It's not like either or. Now it's neither nor, unfortunately, to great extent. So he was talking about this very negative scenarios. It might appear that if Ukraine is not provided properly, our reserve of people, especially people who can serve, especially younger generations, that should also be preserved. If people want to see Ukrainian nation preserved, instead of turning a nation of refugees, instead of being integrated into other societies and forgetting that they are Ukrainians and so on. So that's why, as for me, there is no conflict in all this kind of scenes. And Macron was talking about scenarios that might happen if there is no firepower, if Russians advance. They need to be stopped sooner or later. So NATO choice is either you aid Ukrainian self-defense in southern eastern Ukraine, or being ready to bring more in central and eastern Europe, to decide where is the line, by the way. And whether Ukraine would be on its own able to decide its line with aid of Western countries, I hope so. But he was talking, as for me, about this more negative development, more negative contingency when Russians are advancing and Ukraine is not able to meet all the needs of the battlefield. In meantime, well, I understand why it's so difficult for people to accept this kind of scenes, because it's about totally blowing zone of comfort. Macron is talking about the scenes that are very difficult to accept, but well, we are living in such a world that is changing, and that's precisely the things that should be done now. I mean, thinking out of box, some other initiatives, because it's obvious that on the current model, Putin is not deterred. Putin even is not ready to agree with like ideas that frontline can be moved, and that's the problem. So yeah, it's now very like original, to put it mildly, idea for a lot of countries that are used to very conventional approaches and so on. But who knows what might happen, and what contingency might be. So this debate should be done in advance, uh, to prevent this as a kind of contingency, again, to drive Putin to the conclusion that well, Europe is decisively on Ukrainian side, and to be part of the general equations that would force Putin to durable settlement.
I think what maybe makes this a little more confusing is that I feel like there's a lot of different proposals and suggestions going around at the same time. And on one hand, you have Macron's statements that if Ukraine, what you were talking about, that if Ukraine were struggling to hold back Russia at roughly at the current lines, and it was forced to withdraw significantly and quickly, Europe or NATO countries might be forced to intervene directly. And I think that Poland and the Baltic states have sort of said that they see it in a similar way. And I think that's uh, probably more, I think that's quite realistic that if that was to happen, we'd be forced to make that decision. But I guess at the same time, you have these other alternative suggestions where of countries, of Western countries, um, mm, putting forward some kind of a limited um, protection of Western Ukraine against Russian bombing, or um, putting instructors and trainers on Ukraine's soil. So basically, doing the training of Ukrainian military, but not abroad, but in Ukraine. And I wonder if these suggestions for more limited help directly in Ukraine would are also important to consider, or whether they wouldn't actually play that much of a role.
Well, as for me, that's a good example that these things are related. I'm pretty sure that if we haven't seen these ambitious ideas out of Macron, there won't be these limited ideas. So even from this point of view, Macron ideas are useful one. They push to do something more, because it's obvious that what has been done, it's not enough. Something else should be done. Some other new parts of the equation should be brought to at least make Russia agree with the current front line. I don't know, at least. So as for me, I don't see this kind of conflict. I see it's a kind of bargaining process. The same is true with regards to like Ukrainian NATO ambitions. So Ukrainian part is to formulate the problem, is to raise a problem. Everything else is up to our partners to address them and to bear responsibility. And what we see that, well, some things might be ambitions, but you should do something in response. You should demonstrate some level of commitment. And for sure, if we seen a major commitment to defend western part of Ukraine, first it would spare some air defense assets for the middle of the country to southern Ukraine, northern, eastern Ukraine. So it would be economy of force. And it would also create a kind of safe zone, because we still under threat of Russia. They might strike everywhere, and they know where is the concentration of air defense assets. And under these conditions, you can't organize like military industrial complex and all other things with this level of predictability to function smoothly. So from the number of points of view, that's a valuable thing, along with the training. Because people, as for me, they don't understand that even to bring people back and forth, it cost quite a lot. This is amount of money that might have otherwise be spent on equipment. And that's why this training is also done in Ukraine. That's a valuable new development, along with again demonstrating Russia the very opposite scene. So you wanted to see no NATO boots on the ground in different capacity, even in training capacity, but the result is opposite one. And that's as for me the art of strategy, to bring some unpredictability and to like this initiative, because currently it's Russia that is like forming the contours of the battlefield for its convenience. Western reaction is mostly responsive. During these 2+ years, we haven't seen something too ambitious that would make Russia guess what to do next. So all these scenes, as for me, are valuable and hopefully would bring this mindset. And in meantime, they would have a really positive impact in terms of both air defense, in terms of saving money, in terms of demonstrating different level of commitment. And again, ultimately, it's for also Western countries to decide whether there would be this dividing line, how close it would be to Europe, for instance. So, as Zelensky said on the very first day of the big war, so new Iron Curtain is coming down in Europe, and Ukrainian task is to ensure that we are on the right side in this confrontation. But it's more and more obvious it's not only for Ukraine to decide with proper level of commitment, with proper level of aid, as to where this line would be, how close it would be to European Union and to NATO.
I think it's really interesting the way you framed it, and I guess it's a way that I haven't thought about before, where by proposing something that's quite extreme, such as deploying NATO troops directly to Ukraine to join the combat, you're making the other proposals sound less extreme and more acceptable, and you're sort of increasing the Overton window of what is now an acceptable thing to realistically suggest in a public debate.
Yeah, that's how it works. So either you patiently follow the agenda or you try to frame it. The same is true with our NATO integration. So we formulated our expectations. We explain why we have this kind of expectations. It's up to NATO to meet them or not to meet them and provide something instead to address Ukrainian concerns in different ways, and in the end to have at least something that is mutually agreed and that is supportive to the overall Ukrainian war and strategic effort.
I think there was one thing that I wanted to talk to you and that we've sort of skipped when talking about the support and aid from the US and from Europe. And that's that it seems from various different statements from President Zelensky and his government is that perhaps a solution for this is to build a really strong Ukraine's domestic defense industry that could maybe theoretically partially solve these issues and replace the lack of aid that's coming from abroad. And I've seen that there's definitely a lot of focus on this, but I wonder in your view from Ukraine, what is actually the true capability of Ukraine's to domestically produce the equipment that it needs, and whether it could get to a point where it can become at least partially independent on external deliveries.
Well, I don't know any country except US that is self-sustaining in terms of military needs. So this idea, first, it should be treated from the point of view of this Israeli model or porcupine strategy and so on. So that you have this capability, you're not that kind dependent by Mitch. But again, what we mean by dependence. So you are not dependent on military industrial complex that is on foreign territory, but still you would be dependent on cooperation, because the idea is to bring some mutual enterprises to build production involving Western entities. So you are still depending on cooperation. So you won't be self-sustaining in this kind of things. Another thing is, who is going to fund it? Let's imagine that we have a military industrial complex done cooperatively, jointly with Western entities, different ones, that is able to meet Ukrainian needs. Who is going to fund it? Ukraine is not ready to fund it fully. So we have just 160 billion dollar GDP that is now partly subsidized by Western countries. So when people are saying that this joint production, development of Ukrainian capacity on Ukrainian territory, it's a solution. Yeah, it might be a solution. It would be again given substance to all these agreements, creating leverage also, because in this case we can rely on entities, Western one, and use them as an agent of influence in countries of the origin. But still, the issue: who is going to finance it? Because Ukraine can fully finance it. So when this idea is broached, it's a right one. It's a part of this Israeli model or other things. But the issue is who is going to fund all the needs is still not addressed. Ukraine can fund part of the needs. By the way, we have now a situation when Ukraine is not able to finance all the productions that military industrial complex of Ukraine can now do. So we can dedicate like just 1/3 of necessary amount. And that's the problem. So yes, it should be a part of the major package. So basically, the idea is to construct like a major equation, major framework that would involve both these bilateral agreements, military industrial cooperation, diplomatic, intelligence, and all other cooperations, and create such a web density of connections that would persuade Putin to leave Ukraine alone. And military industrial complex is also part of this equation. But there are some parts that are not addressed, and major part that who is going to fund all that can be theoretically produced by joint ventures done by Ukraine and by Western entities like Lockheed Martin, Bayer, or other systems, notwithstanding other concerns like security, like manpower, because again, skilled manpower is in deficit. That's also very important things that are not currently addressed. But in the end, it's about who is going to fund this initiative, because on its own, Ukraine can't meet all the requirements. And by the way, that's another proof that there won't be cost-free settlement. Any settlement that is about to be durable, it won't be cost-free. So when people are saying that Ukraine should agree with this or that framework, they usually say that it's going to save money. No. If you want to see durability of the settlement, it would require investment to keep true balance of power. So there won't be a period as it was after the Cold War when security was cheap, when security was cost-free. So any framework, part of which is cooperation in military industrial complex, would be with a check. You need to pay.
You've mentioned manpower, and we've talked about it previously as well, but I wanted to dig a little deeper into that because I think the whole discussion about manpower in Ukraine and the mobilization law, I think there's quite a bit of a difference between the discussion that's happening outside of Ukraine and maybe that's happening in Ukraine. And I think that people outside of Ukraine are maybe not aware of how it's actually viewed within Ukraine. So could you maybe just talk a little bit more about that, of how many, roughly, if we know, how many soldiers is Ukraine missing at the moment, and how many it would ideally need to have for this year and the next, and on the other hand, how many it can actually yet mobilize without completely destabilizing the domestic economy. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.